Thank you for taking the time today. My name is Andrew Meehan. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Given the House's announcement yesterday in the late afternoon, we postponed yesterday's press conference to give the House the opportunity to complete its work on the administration's emergency supplemental funding request. As you're aware, the House yesterday overwhelmingly passed the Senate's version of the administration's request by a vote of 305 to 102. Today, the Acting Secretary will give a few remarks regarding the recent passage of the administration's supplemental request and its passage in the House. Following that statement, we'll open it up to a few questions. Please identify yourself by your name and media outlet, and we'd ask that you keep your questions to the topic at hand. With that, I'll turn it over to the Acting Secretary. Sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start with the supplemental and also provide an update on the crisis at the border and the administration's efforts to mitigate it. First, I want to thank the leadership in Congress for moving the emergency supplemental spending package forward to the President. We're hoping he'll sign it early next week. This funding will provide an additional $1.5 billion for the Department of Homeland Security for additional temporary facilities, transportation, medical care, consumables, and surge operations related to the care, custody, and processing of migrants apprehended at the border and crossing at ports of entry. It will help us improve our IT systems that support immigration processing as well. We intend to move very quickly to apply this funding to support our teams managing the crisis on the border and enhancing conditions for families and children in CBP custody, while expediting the transfer of unaccompanied children to well-equipped facilities at Health and Human Services. The funding is also critical for border security. As Acting Director Morgan, CBP leadership and I have advocated repeatedly before Congress and in the media, this humanitarian crisis has taken agents and officers away from their border security and traditional law enforcement missions. We need to get them back on the line, securing the border against smugglers, traffickers, and security threats, arresting fugitives in the interior, and safeguarding the United States. While it has been many weeks coming, I think we should pause to note the significance of the strong bipartisan votes to respond to the administration's request and provide the over $4.5 billion in total to support these humanitarian missions. Although we did not get everything we asked for, including, importantly, additional ICE beds for single adults, the bill substantially addresses our request. And I'd like to thank Leader McConnell, Senator Shelby, and Senator Leahy for their leadership in the Senate, and Speaker Pelosi for bringing the Senate bill to the floor in the House to allow us to get this much-needed relief. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge some of our unsung heroes in this process. Our Budget Director for DHS, Alan Bloom, thank you for joining us. Our Chief Financial Officers at ICE and CBP, Steve Ronconi and Sam Grable, along with our legislative affairs teams, they are the ones who pulled the data together to convince Congress that we needed this funding and could apply it to mitigate the crisis. They almost never receive public credit, and we appreciate them for joining us here today. You truly do support the mission and the men and women on the front line. So thank you very much, and I'm pleased to recognize you. Thanks. All right. So, while the funding will help us make an impact immediately on the border, it will only serve to mitigate the crisis. It's not going to address the fundamental drivers that are contributing to it. It is our hope that this bipartisan effort in the Senate, based on a shared set of facts on what's happening on the border, could be a catalyst, not only for our funding needs, but also in a targeted and focused manner for addressing the weaknesses in our legal framework that, along with our booming economy, have created the pull factors that are fueling this crisis. As the President has made clear, Congress has the power to change the dynamic of migration flows in the region swiftly with several key changes to our immigration laws. We are asking for 3 straightforward fixes to our laws that will help restore integrity to the immigration system at the border and remove the incentives for families and children to cross our border illegally. First, we need to address the pull factors for family units. Currently, due to a single federal district court order, we cannot obtain effective immigration enforcement results for the families arriving at our border. Instead, they cannot be held longer than 21 days, and as a result, do not receive rulings from immigration courts for years. Once a final order is issued from a judge, ICE officers have to go into communities to enforce it and repatriate the family. A better approach is needed and is available. Simply put, we want to be able to address immigration claims as families are encountered at the border by holding families together in appropriate settings during a fair and expeditious immigration process and ensuring that a judge or asylum officer's decision can be effectively implemented. Second, to prevent unaccompanied children from being placed in the hands of criminal smuggling organizations to make a dangerous journey north, The administration has proposed that those seeking refugee or asylum protections should be able to do so within their home country or in a neighboring country. If they meet the standard, they could be protected there or considered for placement in the United States. If they do not have valid protection claims or avoid this safe and orderly process to come to the U.S. border, we are asking for an amendment to our laws to allow us to repatriate them in coordination with the host government. And third, the current asylum standards are misaligned, with a significant difference between the number of migrants who meet the initial credible fear standard, over 80%, but do not have a valid asylum claim at the end of court proceedings, only about 10 to 20%. This allows for migrants arriving at the border to stay for years in the United States, even if they have a very weak claim. These changes were recommended by the Homeland Security Advisory Council Task Force, a bipartisan panel led by experts from across the political spectrum. The legislation proposed by Senate Judiciary Chairman Graham would address these vulnerabilities and end the crisis, and we stand ready to discuss these sensible solutions or others with any willing members of Congress. The time to address the fundamental drivers of this crisis is now. In the meantime, we are not sitting by and waiting on Congress. We are taking action, along with partners in the region, to attack the smuggling organizations driving and profiting from this crisis and to reduce the flow. On this note, I'd like to provide a brief update on the emerging results from our diplomatic and partnership efforts in the region. First, with Mexico. It's become clear that over the past 3 weeks since the administration reached a new agreement with Mexico that we've seen a substantial increase in the number of interdictions on the Mexican southern border and a sincere effort to address the transportation networks coming through Mexico. We look forward to increasing deployments of Mexico's National Guard over the coming weeks and enhanced results from their continued efforts to stem the flow. We've also worked with Mexico to initiate the expansion of the migrant protection protocols at the existing locations, and we are implementing plans to add additional locations across the border in the coming weeks. These initiatives are making an impact, and we are now anticipating a significant reduction in border crossing numbers for June, up to 25% when compared to the record level in May. I would also highlight the partnership we are receiving from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I was in Guatemala on Wednesday for the second time in less than a month to continue our efforts to address the organized smuggling networks in the region. For example, we are implementing a joint agreement to attack human smuggling organizations in Guatemala, and we have supported the Ministry of Public Security there in a number of arrests over the past month that are disrupting these criminal networks. We look forward to further collaboration in the region on protecting and addressing the claims of asylum seekers at the earliest possible point and applaud the focus and ongoing engagement of our partners. To that end, I will be meeting with the presidents and the security ministries of El Salvador and Honduras next week, and our Guatemalan partners will be in Washington for further implementation planning. These are essential efforts in our strategy, and they're making a difference. In closing, I'd like to talk about the importance of the supplemental funding to enhance our ability to improve conditions and address capacity challenges in DHS custody, as well as speeding the movement of unaccompanied children into HHS care. But I want to talk about the aspect of the coverage over the past week on conditions at the border, and I need to offer a word about conditions in DHS custody and our efforts to provide safe care, especially for families and children. For months, I and other leaders at DHS have been warning of increasing numbers of families and children arriving at our border and the fact that our facilities are not appropriate for them, that we needed congressional action to address the factors driving the crisis and ensuring safe conditions. Since December, I have testified to Congress 7 times outlining these challenges, 5 times since May 1st, where I asked for urgent action on the supplemental. On March 27th, we held a press conference at the border talking about border security and the humanitarian crisis reaching a breaking point. We had 14,000 people in custody that day. I held another one on May 11th as we were going toward 20,000 in custody, which is where we were on June 1st. The acting commissioner, chief of the Border Patrol, sector chiefs in the field have all asked for additional resources and highlighted the stark challenges at the border. All of this received relatively limited attention and little action until this past week on the Hill. But unsubstantiated allegations last week regarding a single Border Patrol facility in Clint Station in Texas created a sensation. That's balanced somewhat since several media outlets toured the Clint Station and saw the actual conditions there, a clean and well-managed facility and well-equipped process. But frankly, much of the coverage is simply too late and is missing the story. DHS has applied unprecedented resources and effort to care for the increased arrivals. We've applied over $500 million this year to specifically mitigating the crisis, increasing access to medical professionals in our stations tenfold, investing in transportation supplies, contract care, and support. We have 40 to 50% of our Border Patrol agents in key busiest sectors focused on care of migrants, hospital watch for families and children. Contrary to the reporting, children in CBP custody at the border are receiving access to key supplies, including toothbrushes, appropriate meals, blankets, showers as soon as they can be provided, and medical screening. The real story I would submit to you on the border crisis and our response is about our Border Patrol agents who have chosen a career about protecting others. Border Patrol agents, supported by CBP officers, ICE enforcement and removal officers, Homeland Security Investigation Special Agents, U.S. Coast Guard medical corpsmen, public health service doctors, military professionals, and hundreds of DHS volunteers, along with dedicated NGOs and local border communities, all of whom have been working tirelessly without thanks or enough support to care for the unprecedented surge of vulnerable families and children in our care, all while still securing our border. I'm in awe of their effort and steadfast commitment. At the same time, the story is also about vulnerable populations from Central America who continue to be enticed into a smuggling cycle that puts them at risk and enriches violent criminal organizations. This cycle puts children in danger, as we have seen tragically and devastatingly in the images of Oscar and Valeria on the banks of the Rio Grande. Valeria was the fourth death of a child in the past week attempting to cross into the United States. The situation should not be acceptable to any of us. It should galvanize action and real debate based on what is actually happening on the border and why. And yet, here in Washington, we have collectively failed to act to address the drivers of the crisis. This failure is not on the men and women of DHS, and definitely not on the outstanding Border Patrol agents, CBP officers, and ICE officers who have borne the brunt of the challenges and most of the criticism. They deserve better, and so do the families and children of Central America who are being sold false promises by smugglers. Our men and women deserve the resources they need to address the humanitarian crisis that they're receiving in the supplemental. It goes a long way. But they also need the targeted changes in the immigration laws necessary to restore integrity to the immigration system at the border and our border security. Thank you. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Zolan?
I am at this point right now with the supplemental being passed. Do you still support, or do you support a operation by ICE for undocumented families?
So part of the challenge we've had this past year with this influx is that ICE has had to detail about 400 professionals to the border simply to help process families and manage the migrants coming in, to transfer them to facilities, single adults, or family units to the family residential centers. That means that across the board, our interior enforcement numbers are down. Any balanced enforcement strategy has to attack the problem not only at the origin and the transit through Mexico, but also at the border and in the interior. We have final orders issued from judges that are not being followed through on. We have criminals that are fugitives in the country that we don't have the teams dedicated to address because they're down at the border helping. Mitigating the crisis, first and foremost, stemming the flow, and then working interior enforcement issues simultaneously is where we need to be. That's a balanced immigration enforcement process.
Follow-up. In terms of El Paso sector, because it seems like that's where significant, it seems like from what we see, the problems there seem to be, it's always going back to El Paso. Is there a contributing factor to either both the conditions of the facilities there and the level of migration there that's not existent in other sectors along the border?
Yeah, the number one contributing factor is a tremendous growth in migrant arrivals in El Paso. It's become the second busiest sector on the border. It has not been a major factor in arrivals for several years. It's also been the number one sector for large groups arriving. So that's really challenged their process. Additionally, it's a far-flung sector going from Antelope Wells all the way to Isleta and Point South in Texas. That's a huge area that they have to transport migrants, so it creates a lot of logistical challenges for processing and care along with the high volume numbers.
Colleen?
So once the supplemental is passed, then what happens? After the money is spent, what are you going to do after that money is spent? How are you going to mitigate the increased flows? Even if you have a 25% decline, which is considerable, it's still a lot of people coming. So.
Yeah, no, 25% is not acceptable. We need to continue to work with Mexico and Central America. That's why we're investing so heavily in our diplomatic and partnership strategy. With my time, with the leadership at the components, all engaging directly, sharing intelligence with Mexican authorities, with the new National Guard, and then working to really create the capacity in Guatemala, in Honduras, to address these networks where they're starting. Just think about simple techniques such as identifying those unaccompanied children crossing from Honduras into Guatemala. They need a passport to do that within the CA4 agreement. They've been crossing without a passport for a long time. Guatemala's changed that. They're addressing that. We had the First Ladies of Guatemala and Honduras on the border with us last week with the security ministers and the ministers of foreign affairs. We showed them HSI's interview efforts to identify adults traveling with children that are not their own. We showed them our DNA testing pilot. They were very concerned at the potential for more children from Guatemala and Honduras to be taken by adults that are not their own, trafficked, smuggled, rented, and they want to address it with us. So they're going to look at DNA testing for their own borders, and they're going to look at the same sort of interview and document check techniques that we're using to identify those families that are not presenting as fraudulent.
Luis?
How quickly can money make a difference in changing issues of CBP or HHS, given that the infrastructure you have at the border is designed for single adult males, and the infrastructure that HHS has in its beds may not be equipped for the particular needs of the unaccompanied children population that they're encountering?
Thanks for the question. So first, we didn't wait for the funding to start the process of acquiring additional temporary facilities. We've been building them for months, and we have significant additional contracts underway that are going to come online in mid-July. This funding can be applied directly to those contracts. We started them in anticipation in advance of hopefully either receiving funding or needing to reprogram from other key Homeland Security priorities. So our temporary facility posture is going to be improving dramatically. We just opened another 1,000 beds last Wednesday, and we're going to have significant new facilities coming online in July as well. HHS was doing much the same, identifying additional facilities in Texas and Oklahoma that can take unaccompanied children coming from the border, including the key demographic for us, which is teenagers, teenage boys, about 65%, teenage girls, another 30% in terms of the crossing. So that will all be helpful and applied very quickly by both agencies.
Sorry, last question.
Central American aid, do you still
Yes.
support it?
So I'm in Central America now several times a month at this point in terms of working directly with our partners, identifying those, not only those security programs, but those targeted programs that can make a difference in reducing migrant flow. I absolutely support it, working with State Department to see which programs have a return on investment that can make that kind of impact, and we'll be taking that package forward to see which programs should be supported going forward.
Last question, Dara?
So, given that we are apparently seeing a decrease in apprehensions for June, and as we know, July and August tend to be lower months, when are we going to know that this is actually a policy thing and not a seasonal thing? And in the meantime, is there going to be pressure, if numbers do continue to decrease, to redirect money to other things like interior enforcement instead of sending it to surge resources to the border?
So the supplemental is for the humanitarian mission. It's carefully budgeted and applied for facilities, transport care on the border. It will replace some overtime funding for surge operations for CBP and ICE, but most of that money is really just focused on mitigating the flow and addressing it. In terms of when we're going to know if these efforts in Mexico are making an impact, I think these 3 weeks have demonstrated that they are already. That 25% decrease in June is more than we've seen in past years. We are not really tracking a seasonal pattern anymore. It's more about the pull factors, in my experience, than traditional weather or agricultural seasonal workers. This is a different situation. So I think we're going to know basically by mid-July, and certainly by the end of July, if these efforts are sustained and having a significant impact. We're also going to see additional focus in Guatemala and Honduras come online this summer, an additional capability which I think can also augment the impact of the partnership. So I think we're going to see continued reduction in the numbers, which will alleviate some of the capacity constraints we've had at the same time as we're bringing facilities online, and that should present a much better situation at the border for the arriving migrants and also help address the flow and address the criminals that are profiting from it.
Okay, thanks, everybody. As always, if you have any additional follow-up, please.
Okay, so why don't we keep rolling and why don't we keep rolling and answer our questions? Do you have any concerns about the father and the daughter who drowned in the river says that they were waiting for money from Mexico. Are there any plans to revisit the metering policy for one? Two, you guys, he talks about how he's been sending the alarms on this, but then the president did a national emergency for border wall funding. Why don't, are there any plans to talk about a national emergency for humanitarian assistance at the border?
I think the president spoke for himself on Twitter last night when he applauded everybody for their hard work in the humanitarian crisis.